Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the first RDLA webinar of 2023. I'm going to give everybody just a little bit of time to get logged on, and then we will get started. All right. So again, welcome to today's webinar. If you prefer to call in, you can do so using the number and webinar ID on the screen here. As we go through each of these presentations, we will take questions after each one. So please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box and we will address them to the speakers. Again, for any media joining us, we ask that you formally announce your participation and refrain from quoting any of the discussion during the webinar. If you would like to use direct quotes, we encourage you to follow up with participants afterwards. We also have closed captioning for today's webinar. Shannon will drop a link in the chat for Spanish translation services as well. So in order to get the closed caption started, you just click live transcript on the button, or live transcript on the button on the bottom of your screen. And then if you're interested in the Spanish translation services, you can just click the link that Shannon has put in the chat for you. This is our agenda today, guys. It's going to be a really good one. We are going to get started with David Davenport from the Personalized Medicine Coalition. We will then move to Jamie Sullivan from the EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases. We also have Corinne Alberts from NORD, the National Organization for Rare Diseases. Next, we have Jennifer Waldrop from the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition, Sarah Sultan from Haystack Project, Eric Gashko from National Health Council, and Ellie Dahani from Research America. So David, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you and let you get us started.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Davenport, and I'm the Manager of Public and Science Policy at the Personalized Medicine Coalition. I'd like to thank EveryLife for inviting us to share our priorities today and connect with you all. For those who are not familiar, the Personalized Medicine Coalition has more than 200 members spanning the healthcare spectrum, and our members represent an array of disease areas and patient populations, including cancers and rare diseases, all with an interest in advancing this approach to care. Among our membership is also EveryLife, and we're grateful to share memberships in each other's organizations. At the end of the day, PMC wants personalized medicine to benefit patients like you with diagnosed or suspected rare diseases. Next slide, please. Just to level set, we define personalized medicine as a fast-growing approach to healthcare in which physicians use information from diagnostic tests along with a patient's medical history to guide prevention and treatment plans that are consistent with a patient's biology, values, and circumstances. When it comes to rare disease, personalized medicine plays an important role in helping to diagnose rare diseases and helping to develop treatments for patients based on their genetic origins. Every year, PMC releases a report highlighting personalized medicines that have been approved by the FDA. Since we first conducted this analysis back in 2015, personalized medicines have consistently accounted for a quarter or more of all new treatments approved by the agency. Over the past decade, we have also seen a growing trend of approvals outside of oncology, especially in areas like rare disease. We are currently analyzing our approvals from 2022, but we do expect these trends to continue, and we will be publishing the final analysis in February. Each year, similar to EveryLife, PMC engages its members in defining our policy priorities for the coming year, and these fall into 4 buckets: modernizing regulatory policies, modernizing coverage and payment policies, advancing innovation in care delivery and the value of personalized medicine, and finally, cultivating support for personalized medicine among policymakers in Congress and the administration. There are many topics I could cover from the resulting policy agenda with you all today, but I'll focus on some of our top legislative priorities that may be of particular interest to you all in rare. Next slide, please. One of the key vehicles we see for cultivating support for personalized medicine in Congress is through the Congressional Personalized Medicine Caucus. Following a multi-year effort supported by our members, a bipartisan bicameral group of lawmakers launched the Congressional Personalized Medicine Caucus back in 2020, just before the start of the COVID pandemic. Members of the caucus are committed to ensuring that healthcare policies in the United States advance personalized medicine, and the caucus offers opportunities to consistently educate members of Congress and shape legislation. The caucus is not focused on any disease in particular, but we do believe the caucus complements the work of other disease caucuses, including the Rare Disease Caucus. The caucus has been co-chaired by Senators Kirsten Sinema and Tim Scott, as well as Representatives Eric Swalwell and Tom Emmer. At the start of the new Congress, Representative Emmer was elected Majority Whip for the House and is therefore stepping down from his role as co-chair. And we are very thankful for his service on the caucus for the past few years and are working to secure a new House Republican to co-chair and join Representative Swalwell, as well as Senators Sinema and Scott. This year, we're also focused on continuing to grow bipartisan membership in the caucus, and we're planning to hold 2 educational briefings. Our most recent briefing with the caucus was in December on how personalized medicine can improve diagnosis and treatment for patients. We had a range of disease areas represented, and I'd like to thank Dylan Simon from the EveryLife team for joining to speak on behalf of the rare community about the importance of access to genetic and genomic testing for improving the diagnostic odyssey. You can find more information about the caucus on the webpage that's linked in the slide. Next slide, please. For the past several years, PMC, along with the EveryLife Foundation, the Assistance Fund, and others have been engaged in advancing a bill called the Precision Medicine Answers for Kids Today Act that would go a long way toward helping the US maximize the benefits of genetic and genomic testing and address the diagnostic odyssey experienced by children with rare diseases. The bill was introduced in the previous Congress by the Personalized Medicine Caucus co-chairs, Eric Swalwell and Tom Emmer, along with Representative Scott Peters from California. The bill was also included in Cures 2.0. Among its provisions, the bill would create a 3-year demonstration program at the Department of Health and Human Services for up to 15 states to cover genetic testing and genomic sequencing and measure how it improves the diagnosis of pediatric health conditions. The bill would also require CMS to gather data and report on how often genetic testing and genomic sequencing are covered and reimbursed, which would help fill a critical evidence gap around access barriers. Third, it includes a study from the National Academy of Medicine that would provide meaningful recommendations about how the federal government can facilitate provider and patient access to genetic and genomic testing in rare and other disease areas. Finally, it includes a provision that would require CMS to provide guidance to states on how they can increase the frequency of coverage for genetic testing and genomic sequencing through the Early and Periodic Screening, Diagnostic, and Treatment Benefit Program. We are fortunate that this last provision was included in report language in the end-of-year spending omnibus. And in this new Congress, we'll be working toward the reintroduction of the bill, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate with EveryLife and others in the rare community around advancing the bill. Moving on to the next item, for almost a decade, PMC has been engaged in discussions around modernizing the regulatory oversight of diagnostic tests and providing feedback to inform a legislative solution. Near the end of the year, there was a push to include the VALID Act in the end-of-year omnibus. This ultimately did not happen. In addition, there have been related efforts led by the lab community to modernize CLIA. We have heard that there may be attempts to get diagnostics reform added to the pandemic preparedness package this Congress, and that FDA may also take action on their own with rulemaking since there hasn't been traction on a legislative solution. All that said, diagnostic reform does remain a top policy issue for our members, and we plan to continue to stay engaged. In the previous Congress, Representatives DeGette and Upton, the latter of whom just retired, led the development and introduction of Cures 2.0. This bill included numerous provisions related to real-world evidence, clinical trials, advancing digital health, and modernization at CMS that would follow up on the 21st Century Cures Act. It is uncertain exactly how Cures 2.0 will advance this Congress, and we haven't heard yet if it'll be taken up as a full bill. Regardless, we would still be very supportive of it happening since the latest version of the bill included the Precision Medicine Answers for Kids Today Act and a number of other important policy priorities that could help advance personalized medicine. And finally, every year, PMC advocates for increased appropriations to NIH and the FDA, given the crucial role these agencies play in personalized medicine. While we were fortunate to see both agencies receive increases in the final omnibus for FY 2023, the current discourse around rolling back total spending to FY 2022 levels does make us concerned that these agencies could face budget cuts in the next cycle. And while they are not listed on the slide, following a very productive legislative session last year, some of our other policies on the regulatory side for this year include implementation of the user fee commitments at FDA, as well as the implementation of the provisions passed through the Inflation Reduction Act, especially around Medicare negotiation of drug prices. I'd like to thank Every Life again for inviting PMC to come back again for the third year in a row to share our policy priorities, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I'll also like to thank you for allowing me to go first, since I unfortunately do have to drop off before the end of the call, but I will drop my email address in the chat, and if any questions do come up later today, you're welcome to reach out to me over email if there's anything I can help answer.
Great. Thank you so much, David. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat or Q&A right now, but definitely keep an eye on them. And if you have any questions for David, please put those into the Q&A for him.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin.
Yeah, thank you. So next we have Jamie Sullivan from the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases.
Great, thanks, Caitlin, and thanks to everyone on the line who's joined today. I'm really honored to present alongside all of the dedicated colleagues that are on today and who are really amazing advocates for the rare disease community and beyond, and really just do such great work as collaborators. So I'm going to walk you through a few of the sort of overarching Every Life policy priorities for 2023. I will say, just as an intro, the Every Life policy team is in the process of finalizing 2023 priorities. I'll give you some insight into that process and the issues that emerged, from that process. We do this really alongside our community Congress members. Many of you are on the call today, but that is our network of over 300 rare disease stakeholder organizations across the rare disease ecosystem. And the priorities that run through today are primarily drawn from a series of December engagements, most notably the annual meeting of Community Congress, which we were so thrilled to have in hybrid fashion this year, and other engagements along with the Congressional Rare Disease Caucus and others. And then yesterday we held the first of 4 working groups meetings. Those working group members review and provide feedback on the priority issues that are out there that will help guide our legislative and regulatory policy strategies. So because we're in a new Congress, you may be familiar in the last couple years, you've seen our federal priorities grid, and it maps into the issues that we lead, engage, support, and monitor. That's not what I'm going to show you today, because we're in a new Congress. We're really focused on establishing those core priority issue areas, and then from there, as new bills and new efforts get introduced, using the core areas to evaluate and decide what pieces of legislation we might be prioritizing. So really what's important right now is just getting that framework in place. And so if you're new to Every Life, our core priorities fall into these 3 areas. Of course, elimination of the diagnostic odyssey, reduction and elimination via newborn screening and other diagnostic work, therapy development being, the really central to the mission of Every Life and one of the main reasons we were created. Of course, developing expedient pathways for discovery and approval of effective therapies for rare diseases, that 95% that is still waiting for that first approved treatment, as well as making advances in diseases that do have a treatment. And then of course, at the end of the road here in the access environment, making sure that rare disease patients have access to approved therapies that are out there in a timely and appropriate way. So next slide, Caitlin. We'll walk you through each of them at a high level. I'm happy to answer any questions. And as the year goes on, we'll get into more specifics. But first is newborn screening and diagnostics. The Community Congress priority areas that have emerged. Broadly, of course, reduction and elimination of the diagnostic odyssey, that's central to everything in this category. But I wanted to highlight one that was not on the list last year that has grown in importance, and we heard a ton about through our interactions last fall, were workforce capacity issues. The labs especially are struggling, the diagnostic field, genetic counselor access, geneticist access, all of the critical workforce that is necessary to help make timely diagnostic decisions is, they're really struggling. And so that was brought to us by a number of stakeholders, something that we are working just next week, we'll be talking about with our newborn screening and diagnostic working group and trying to map and see what the environment is for policy solutions and where we can play a role in helping support those policy solutions that will be most impactful to the workforce needed in rare disease diagnostics. We, of course, are interested in coverage and reimbursement for genetic testing. You heard David talk about the federal effort around the Precision Medicine Answers for Kids Today Act. We're also, and I should say this applies to a number of these issues, while I'm focused on federal today, we are also working on several parallel state issues. So genetic testing coverage is definitely an issue that is going to be very prominently worked on in the states this year by us and other partners. And then coverage and reimbursement for genetic counselor work and other state-based issues will happen as well. So just moving on, maybe what you are most familiar with in our state work is the state RUSP alignment legislation. So we've had some remarkable progress in the last couple of years, and we are continuing to push forward in our efforts to make sure that states are adding new conditions that have been added to the federal RUSP and recommended for newborn screening, that they're adding them in a timely and appropriate fashion, and that is more automatically considered at the state level, and that the state labs have the resources they need to make those additions in a timely way. This year, we are going to be leading bills and are in the process of leading bills in Texas and Wisconsin, but we are always open to supporting other efforts in states that are still waiting for RUSP alignment. And Dylan, who was mentioned earlier on our team, is a great source of expertise for those working in states on newborn screening work. And then lastly, translating the great effort last year, which was the Newborn Screening Modernization Roundtable Series, where we brought together newborn screening stakeholders from all aspects of the newborn screening system to really look at what are the modernization needs of the newborn screening system and how can we come up with a series of recommendations that can be translated into policy action. And that publication will be coming out later this year. And from there, it's our turn to take those solutions and translate them into policy action. So that is a high-level review of newborn screening and diagnostics. Of course, there is so much more, but we will move on to therapy development. Okay. So last year was a big year for therapy development with the passage of the new user fee reauthorization and all of the various bills and policy issues that were addressed in the omnibus. Now, coming off that year, we go into a year where FDA is starting to implement a number of those provisions that were in the omnibus, much of which were related to rare diseases, and thanks to the rare disease advocacy of the groups and the individuals on this call. But there are some things that were left unaddressed, and there's some opportunities to make progress moving forward. This year is the 40th year of the Orphan Drug Act. That is a huge milestone, and it's important that we celebrate, of course, the tremendous achievements made possible by the Orphan Drug Act. However, it's also important that we come together as a community and think about, what is still left to do? Where are there unmet needs, and where are there specifically, needs for more incentives, other policy changes that can build upon that ODA foundation. We also still will be thinking about the threats that are out there. And our hope is that we can move from a position of continually defending the incentives that are granted to rare disease drug development, but instead of just defending those threats, we can move to proactively addressing what the needs of the community are. However, we do need to acknowledge that there is, there was a piece of the Inflation Reduction Act that does pose a threat to the incentives to invest in repurposing research, so meaning finding additional uses for already approved drugs. And so that is an issue that we'll be working with our regulatory and public policy working groups to discuss and try and come together to advocate for a targeted solution to that specific piece of the IRA. Just for the sake of time, I'll move on to access, though not, skipping over a few issues, and that does certainly not mean that they are less important. So lastly, our access and value area. We had a really productive year engaging with several subgroups within our access working group who prioritized and fleshed out some policy principles and some other core rare disease unmet needs in the access space. And our hope is that this year our focus becomes on increasing that engagement with the payers who have some ability to help address some of those challenges and obstacles that rare disease patients are facing. We will, have a number of new data points coming out over the course of the year, and there were last year as well. And we hope that we can then leverage this engagement with our subgroups and the new data to really have productive conversations with payers across the board. We will absolutely be working to support some very meaningful work around harmful utilization management techniques that have been just growing in use and burden to the rare disease community. Things like inappropriate prior authorization use, the really proliferation of copay accumulator and maximizer programs. And one thing that really was clear at the annual meeting this year was the increasing practice of just lasering out whole rare disease treatment categories from self-insured plans, those plans that are generally large employer plans, and the real harmful impact that is having on employees that get their, with rare disease and their families that are getting their insurance through these plans. So we are sort of doubling down on those efforts, many of which will happen at the state level as well. And I'm looking, I know there's many great collaborators working across the board, so we will be looking to see how we can support those efforts. And then lastly, just really focusing again on the role of patient experience data, patient-centered approaches in the access environment, both in the valuation, so value assessments that reflect patient-centered approaches, and then how can we really pull forward the patient experience data that is so increasingly common in going into therapy development. How do we pull that into the access space? So that was a whirlwind walk through some of the overarching priorities, and I'm happy to take questions along the way or at the end. And we will be continually in touch with more specific legislative priorities as they develop.
Thank you, Jamie. We have a few questions for you. One is, what can be done about prior authorization delaying care, even in cancer patients?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the issues that's been flagged by Congress. Mostly in what Congress is looking at is Medicare Advantage, prior auth policies, but there's been some look into Medicaid as well, because prior auth is a tool that Medicaid plans have to really restrict coverage. Certainly it's a barrier to rare. The subgroup that we have formed on utilization management practices has walked through and evaluated some of the proposals around improving timelines for prior auth responses, improved communication and exchange of information, so there's transparency, and that maybe we can help prevent some barriers. That's probably not good enough for rare. There should be some other restrictions in those principles. We'd be happy to share once they're ready to go, but we're evaluating state legislative models that have been put out for prior auth reform, and a number of opportunities for comment at CMS as well.
Great. And the next question is, are the bills that are going to require coverage for genetic testing going to be for private insurances, or will that also cover government insurances like Medicaid?
Great question. I think it's a bit of it depends. Primarily, I would expect that they're going to address Medicaid or other state regulated plans. So, the individual market, it could be, but primarily the efforts have been aimed at Medicaid coverage.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie. All right, so we are now going to move to Corinne Alberts. Corinne is joining us from the National Organization for Rare Disorders, or NORD. So Corinne, I will go ahead and pass things over to you.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you to RDLA and the whole EveryLife team for having us here today. And hi to everyone who's joined us. So like Caitlin said, I'm Corinne Alberts. I'm Associate Director of Policy with the National Organization for Rare Disorders. So if you're not super familiar with us yet, NORD began as a collective of patients and caregivers advocating for the Orphan Drug Act in 1983. And in the 4 decades since our founding, we have continued to work alongside our member organizations, our partners, and our incredible advocates to push for and implement solutions to help alleviate the day-to-day burdens and challenges facing people with rare disorders. So with that, I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about some of the issue areas that we are focusing on in 2023. I'm not going to be able to get to them all, but try to pull out a couple of key highlights for us to walk through today. So we can go to the next slide. And the first issue area that I wanted to highlight regards how to improve access to care across state lines and through telehealth. So something that people with rare disorders often struggle with is there are no specialists appropriate for your needs close to home. People often have to travel significant distances or across state lines in order to get necessary care and treatment. This is something that we've polled our community on before. And then again and again, it comes back that the significant travel distances and inability to access things across state lines or through telehealth is a significant barrier to health and well-being. So we were pleased to see many Medicare telehealth flexibilities that were first made available at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic extended last year up to 2024, but we still don't think that that's sufficient. And we want to see the provisions that have made telehealth available, that have made a real positive impact on our community, made permanent. And in order to do that, we need to have legislative solutions. And so that's going to be a priority this year. We're also focusing on other ways that we can improve the ability of patients to access care across state lines through policies such as the Accelerating Kids Access to Care Act, which hasn't been reintroduced yet this year. But what this bill would do is it would ease the red tape that can delay children who have Medicaid or CHIP coverage from getting necessary care in other states other than their home where they primarily reside. So currently, if a child needs medical care in an adjacent state, the provider or in some cases, the entire care team must be screened and enrolled by the child's home state Medicaid program. What this bill would do is create a pathway to screen and enroll pediatric providers in multiple state Medicaid programs if certain requirements are met, such as being in good standing with your home state Medicaid program, or being in good standing with the Medicare program, things like that. What this change would do is it would speed up the entire bureaucratic process. The program is voluntary and no changes would be made to the home state's jurisdiction to negotiate things like payments with out-of-state providers or to authorize out-of-state care. This is really key for the rare disease community, where often our patients aren't going to other states because they want to for some reason. It's because there is no one in the home state who's really knowledgeable or specialized in your specific rare disorder. Going down to the second bullet, another priority is something I think that Jamie and David have already spoken about really well, which is improving access to genetic testing and diagnostics. As this audience is, I'm sure, really well aware of, a challenge that people with rare disorders often encounter is just getting that initial diagnosis, and the ability to rapidly identify a rare disorder through genetic testing, genome, exome sequencing, and shortening that diagnostic odyssey has incredible potential to improve the well-being of people in our community. And improving access to these diagnostic tools through policy is something that we at NORD are also trying to make a big priority, not just this year, but in years to come, looking both federally and at the state level. And then the last bucket on this slide that I wanted to highlight is how federally we are protecting progress in rare disease drug development. And this is something that I could spend 10 minutes on just on this, but I won't. But like David and Jamie also, I think, spoke about really well, is we're moving into a real regulatory phase on a number of key legislative packages that moved through last year. So talking about PDUFA, as well as changes to the accelerated approval pathway that were included at the end of your omnibus, and the drug negotiation provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. All of those bills have significant provisions that are going to be implemented in 2023. And we are keenly focused on that activity and trying to make sure that the rare disease patient perspective is at the front and center of all of those implementation conversations. The last thing that I want to mention on this slide is that in 2023, NORD is going to continue to advocate in Congress for legislation to codify the FDA's longstanding interpretation of orphan drug exclusivity. We believe that this is necessary to protect incentives for drug development for rare diseases, especially in children and for people with less common variation of rare diseases, after that longstanding interpretation was kind of thrown into flux by a court case in the 11th Circuit Court. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right, so now I'm going to switch gears from talking about our federal priorities to talking a bit about what we have going on at the state level in 2023. And on this slide, I wanted to focus a bit on our work that we're doing with rare disease advisory councils. So RDACs are an advisory body that is created within a state that provide a platform for the rare community to have a strong voice in state government and to make recommendations to policy leaders directly from the community. NORD's Project RDAC is designed to optimize existing RDACs and to increase the number of RDACs across the country. Our goal is to have one set up in every single state. Under this initiative, we provide opportunities for the existing RDACs to collaborate with each other and exchange best practices on a regular basis. We provide educational resources for them at every single step of their journey. And we also work in states that don't yet have RDACs set up to create coalitions and to pass legislation that could create high functioning RDACs to provide that platform. As in past years, in 2023, we are working with our advocates across the country and with many of you and the folks on this call to build these diverse coalitions to pass RDAC legislation. Last year, there were 4 states that passed new legislation, and I think this year we have movement in as many as 9. And this, again, is a really exciting area that we came out of 2023 with a lot of really positive momentum and excited to carry that on to do even more work in 2023. Now we're in 2023 time. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in the interest of time, I didn't want to just paste every single thing that we're doing at the state level onto a slide, but I would be remiss if I didn't put in a plug for some of our work that we're doing around access and affordability this year. So when you have a rare or complex health condition, access to comprehensive health insurance is a real non-negotiable. And so we are continuing to really make this a key focus of ours. We're supporting Medicaid expansion efforts across different states. We're excited to see several states explore policies like continuous eligibility, which can reduce coverage losses and to keep people insured instead of falling off and becoming uninsured. This year is going to be a big year in kind of the Medicaid coverage and access space because the maintenance of effort provisions that have stopped Medicaid programs from doing eligibility redeterminations is going to end. And so this is a really key few months where we might see people lose coverage, including many people with rare disorders. And we want to make sure that the states are really sticking the landing and being held accountable to those patients. We are also concerned about the spread of discriminatory junk insurance plans that don't meet the standards of the Affordable Care Act. These insurance-like products are often marketed like insurance. They sometimes look like insurance, but they're not, and they don't have the robust benefits that patients really depend on and can often drop people when they become ill. We're also continuing to work for step therapy protections around the country. Issues with prior authorization step therapy and these insurance design policies can be a real problem for members in our community, and something that we hear about. One of the most often things that we hear about from our advocates when we bring them together to see what's been causing them difficulty in their day-to-day lives as they try to access care. Next slide, please. And before I wrapped up, I wanted to refer everyone to our state report card. So this is a report that NORD puts out every single year. We grade all 50 states in the District of Columbia across 9 different major areas, including the things I mentioned already, like step therapy, access to Medicaid and to state regulated insurance, and then other issues like newborn screening, telehealth, and access to medical nutrition products. So we are going to be releasing our 2023 state report card early next week. And we are urging everyone to check it out, see how your state measures up, and please feel free to use it as a tool in your own advocacy. I'm going to pause here for questions, but again, thank you all for being here. And thank you to Caitlin and the whole team for bringing me on.
Thank you so much. I'm looking to see if we have any questions here for you. All right, I'm not seeing any right now, but keep an eye on the chat and Q&A for any that may come in. And thank you so much for joining us today. This was super informative. All right, so next we are going to move to Jennifer Waldrop. Jennifer is joining us from the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition. So Jennifer, I will go ahead and turn things over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for being here today. As those that have spoken before me, we are so glad and grateful that you can make it. This webinar would not be possible without the audience that we see here today. So thank you. It's a pleasure to return to RDLA's monthly webinar. If for those that stay tuned and do their webinar on a regular basis, you may have remembered that I was here back in December, so it is not Groundhog's Day yet. I'm honored to represent the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition. I am new executive director that started in Q4 of last year. Next slide, please. If you are not familiar with the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition, I wanted to provide a little bit background. And listening to those that have already spoken, we probably are one of the youngest in today's webinar. We were launched back in May of 2020. Our purpose was really to address the extraordinary challenges faced by rare disease patients of marginalized populations. Our coalition is focused on reducing racial disparities in the rare disease community, and we are committed to bringing together rare disease experts, health and diversity advocates, and industry leaders to identify and advocate for evidence-based solutions. So you'll see in a little bit more about who some of those folks are. Next slide, please. A little bit about the RDDC. We really are focused on living in a world without health inequities and obstacles that are experienced by diverse patients with rare diseases. So our difference, I think, from what you're hearing from others is that we really drill down and bring in that experience that diverse patients have as they are working through and living with rare diseases. Next slide, please. So the coalition came together and decided that, we wanted to focus on some major areas, many of which you've already heard. So this is probably not new to you, but it is a focus for the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition. And what that means is that we also have 5 working groups. The Delays in Diagnosis is one working group where their goal and their mission is to address the disproportionate barriers to rare disease diagnosis the diverse patient populations often face. This can delay, obviously, treatment, access to care and clinical trials, and negatively impact the health outcomes. Our Delays in Diagnosis group last year was able to launch the Know Your Family Health website, which allows you to have a toolkit around knowing more about your family health. We had about metrics for 1,000 folks, and we had over 10,000 folks that were a part of that. So that was really successful. Patient and caregiver. That working group really focuses on overcoming some of the barriers that diverse patients are faced with and their caregivers, disproportionately facing coverage access, affordability, timely treatment for rare diseases, as well as their underrepresentation within the rare disease community. We are successful with some of the surveys that we have done, and we're getting to partner with organizations like NORD to do an upcoming survey. So stay tuned on that. Provider education. We're looking at improving the equity in the rare disease space through education of medical professionals as rare disease impact communities of color, recognizing that rare disease symptoms and treating patients with rare diseases. We've done some improvements in some of the clinical trial information around the education originally called Bare Genes, and now they're called Gene Clips. And we've added the lens of diversity in some of these educational materials that providers have access to. The 4th group here is diversity in clinical trials. As some of your folks have mentioned, clinical trials is obviously really important in the rare disease space. And we want to take a look at the pipeline and take a look at it through the systemic issues that perhaps inhibit low-income people and people in communities of color from participating in research and clinical trials. And the fifth group here, which we'll spend some time on the next slide, and it's important in today's webinar, is around policy and government legislation. We evolve the public policy landscape with our allies and partners, like you all that are on the call today, to increase awareness and understanding of rare diseases and diversity issues, especially as they relate to rare diseases for patients of color. So those are the 5 working groups, and we'll go on to go deeper into the policy area. Next slide, please. So when we look at the policy area, we think about it through the lens of what the coalition came to be and how we got together. We're made up of members, and we're made up of nonprofits and for-profits. And as we are a pretty young organization, we look to Congress, we look to organizations and to individuals to help move the needle when it comes to rare diseases for the underserved population. And what we mean by that is when we look at the congressional side of things, we identify folks that are part of perhaps the Rare Disease Diversity Caucus. So similar to the personalized, medical coalition, the medicine coalition that was discussed earlier by David, there's also a coalition specifically for rare diseases. Last year, Congressman Butterfield actually retired. And so there's a new congressperson, it's a Congresswoman, Matsui. So we want to get to know Congresswoman Matsui a little bit better, and so that she can perhaps help us through some of the issues that are faced with people of color and underserved populations with rare diseases. We were able to work with Congresswoman Strickland last year. And so we actually put together a bill for rare diseases of diversity folks. And Strickland has shared that with Congress, and she's looking to do some more with that this year as well. So we didn't go very far with that, just given everything with the elections last year, but we'll continue to work with Congresswoman Strickland moving forward. With organizations like Every Life, organizations like NORD, we work with them and they sit on our work groups. We have a number of folks probably on today's call that are part of the work group, so thank you all. Julia Jenkins, as an example, is one of our key leads in our policy work group. So we take a look at what our major stakeholders are doing and how can we help, and we look at it through the national lens. And then, of course, through individuals. And as I mentioned, we're made up of different types of members. Last year, as we were moving towards the end of wrapping up for Congress, we actually reached out to all of our members, looked at the things that we had done within the bill that we were hoping to pass, and we asked our folks to write letters to key congressional folks to be able to encourage and implore folks to to help out there in that space. So we just try to mobilize and work with individuals as well, because we know that everybody can be a policy champion if they're interested. So we do take a multi-pronged approach in this work on the national level. Next slide, please. So really thinking about what we've done in the past and thinking about what we're doing in the future. So in the past, this organization, like I said, has just started not too long ago. We started to create these work groups, these major work groups on the national level. Was trying to identify the opportunities that made sense for the majority of folks that were in the meetings. And so looking at a lot of different things that everyone has talked about so far: genetic testing, newborn screening, telehealth. All those topics were put into the bill that we had proposed for rare diseases for diversity populations. And so we will continue to look at the omnibus that folks have mentioned and see where we need to continue to move forward with some of this work. As mentioned, also, there's lots of provisions in there, and our difference is that we're looking at it through a lens of diverse communities. So when we continue to think about what's going to happen in 2023, we had some traction. Certainly creating a bill is no small effort. And so we will continue to work through some of that for this coming year. We'll continue to build up our relationships with these lawmakers. As mentioned, we've got some new folks as part of the caucus. We have lots of new doctors and clinicians and other medical practitioners that are now in Congress as well. So there's an opportunity for RDDC to meet with these folks. In our work, we're going to continue to try and center the voices of marginalized populations who have rare diseases in any way that we can. And we'll start to look at not just from the policy perspective, but start to see what we can move into the rule perspective as well. Next slide, please. So I'd love to stay in touch. If you're not familiar with our organization, there's our website. We do have a hashtag, of course. And one of the big wins for last year is that we have our own platform and all of these different social media sites. So we'll see you online. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. We don't have any questions for you yet, but keep an eye out on the chat and the Q&A. And for all of you watching, if you have any questions for Jennifer, please submit your questions there. All right, next we have Sarah Sultan joining us from the Haystack Project to share their 2023 policy priorities.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. I too want to thank, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you perfect.
Okay, terrific. I too want to thank you and the Every Life team and RDLA for inviting me to come and speak for Haystack Project. I will say this has been really nice to listen to what everyone else has already said before. I can see so many synergies between the work we're doing at Haystack Project and you guys are all doing. And so I'll make a plug for being an alliance partner with Haystack so that we can chat quarterly about the kind of work you guys are doing. We too try to follow a dissect issues into where we can be leading on something or where we can just support others in the work they are doing. And in listening to the previous speakers, I would just say, Jennifer, would love to support you however we can on diversity of clinical trials, and Corinne on the work you're doing on Medicaid expansion states and step therapy protections and telehealth. There's just so many issues each of you have talked about. Workforce issues, Jamie, that you mentioned is something that Haystack has not focused on at all. But would love to be supportive to you all on. So with that said, I only have really a couple of slides I'd like to focus on, and then I'll just talk a little bit about some of the other work we're doing. So on the next slide, Haystack Project patient groups always remind me that I don't pause and say, look, we did it. So I'm going to do that. So last year we got a big win. This is a legislation that was conceived by the patient groups that participate with Haystack Project. It was something we did fly-ins on, we negotiated, we drafted, we reconciled, we met with people on the Hill, and then negotiated some more and then held our breath through the Omni process and finally got significant portions, not a perfect bill, but certainly way more than we had initially hoped when we got started on this process. So if you haven't seen this language and would like to, please find it on our website at haystackproject.org. And others have mentioned the need to sort of work with FDA now in the implementation phase, and to the extent that this legislation and the provisions that made it into the omnibus are important to you, I hope you'll reach out to the people at Haystack Project to work on this with them. There's a work group they have that includes patient groups, industry partners, medical societies, individual physicians that will be looking at how to partner on this topic. On the next slide, I will, this is just, this is meant to just show, illustrate the sort of circuitous journey we took on the HEART Act over a 2-year process. So I'll just skip over this one for now. And if we go to the next slide, this is legislation that we started working on last year. And we will reintroduce it this year. It was introduced in the House as HR 6160, so you can still find the language there in congress.gov or on our website. Many of the groups that already spoke talked about prior authorization and step therapy and utilization management. So this legislation actually addresses the precursor to those problems, if you will. So if all of us buy insurance or get insurance from our employers or through Medicare or through Medicaid, we're essentially contracting and for what they call medically necessary care. We pay our premiums and our deductibles, and in return, we get medically necessary care. And medically necessary care is defined almost always as something on label or in compendia. And so because so much of what rare disease patients need is not on label, and there really is no compendia for us, we end up not getting through the gate of medical necessity. So I like to say that rare disease patients wish they had, in many instances, the luxury of fighting prior authorization and step therapy and other utilization management, but we often get stuck at this sort of gate, I say, of medical necessity. And so this legislation builds on precedent that Congress set more than a dozen years ago in cancer and applies that logic to the rare community as well, and says that if the uses that are medically necessary for you, that your doctors say are medically necessary for you, are not on the label or in compendia, but they are in 2 peer-reviewed journal articles or in clinical guidelines, that they should meet the threshold of medical necessity. So this is a fairly arcane reimbursement issue, but one that really impacts our patients and our families. And so if you'd like to learn more about this, there's also a work group at Haystack Project on this one. And I'll mention that Tiara Logan on the Haystack Project is probably the one to email if you have any questions about this. And because I'm terrible at emailing and typing at the same time or talking at the same time, I will put her information in the chat momentarily for those who are more interested in the legislation. This legislation has been introduced in the House by 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, 2 members on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and 2 members on the Ways and Means Committee. So we've had Matsui, who Jennifer mentioned earlier, is now one of the co-chairs of the Rare Disease Caucus. So she has worked on this bill all last year with us and will reintroduce it this year. Thompson and Kelly will also reintroduce this year, and Mullen has moved to the Senate. So we are looking for a new Energy and Commerce Republican before reintroducing in the House. And then back in November, the work group on this bill decided that they wanted to organize a fly-in, a very targeted small fly-in after the elections. And we met with, we organized patients, caregivers from individual states to meet with different Senate offices in the hopes that we could get the bill introduced in the Senate. We've made some good progress there and are hoping in the coming month or 2 to be able to get the bill introduced in the Senate as well. Maybe while I'm on this slide, I will also just say that, as so many other groups have already commented, once you get through medical necessity, you definitely have these problems of prior authorization, step therapy, lasering. I think even one of you mentioned, I think it was Jamie who mentioned it. These are all the kind, and then I would add to that study periods, P&T committee, hurdles, and the like. In 2020, we organized a very deep dive with all of our patient groups, their industry partners, all coming together to talk about what was keeping them up at night, what was presenting difficulties in the real world out there on the insurance, access, reimbursement, value front. And from that list, we culled down, with the help of some Hill offices, really what was feasible, what was doable, and what was not at that time. That led to this legislation. But now that we have finished the IRA and finished some of the Part D reforms, we are dusting off that list from 2020 and coming back to see what got done and what did not get done, and sort of still setting our priorities for 2023, much as Jamie described that Every Life Has Two. So want to stay very much in touch with all of the groups who've talked on this call already, because we really don't want to duplicate efforts. To the extent we can just be supporting one of your efforts, we can focus our attention on driving maybe a different bill. The other thing I would like to mention is we've been also getting some feedback from our patient groups outside of reimbursement utilization management issues. the transition to adulthood and the peer-to-peer consults and the very sort of focused problems rare disease patients seem to be having there. And so perhaps as we think about what to prioritize and what you all are prioritizing, we can pick apart where each of us can take a lead on something. One or two groups also mentioned value frameworks. So I want to mention something there as well. As all of you are working on the broader framework of value assessments at ICER, et cetera, Haystack Project has started a project that they have done one patient group, one company at a time, where they have analyzed, they've put together a team of people who are medical writers, reimbursement specialists, economists. I'm forgetting everyone who's on the team, but they've been slowly but surely building a library of one disease at a time with treatments coming to market in that disease, where we help the patient groups articulate what value means to them, but translate it into economic terms that are relevant to the payers, relevant to ICER, even relevant to Congress. And so getting ahead of those before there's an ICER review, it really helps the patient groups have surveys and data and articulated value propositions going into an ICER review. So it's great to do those in advance. If you are a patient group with a treatment option in phase 3 trials, for example, it's good time to be starting to think about those and to consider doing what we call a patient-oriented value, or POV, a play on point of view report with Haystack Project. We are also reinvigorating a number of work groups from last year, including this one on HR 6160, but also on a pilot we are kicking off at the state level to help, again, one patient group at a time, think about and help support one patient group, 2, 3 patient groups in a handful of states, navigate how to fight for access for their product as it's coming to market. So how to meet with the state Medicaid directors, the pharmacy directors, the things that the places that are sort of in the bowels of government at the state level that are really making important decisions about delaying or denying access to new treatments for patients. So the idea of this pilot, which we are calling HP50, was again born out of one of the work groups. We received some funding for it, and so are looking for 1 to 2 patient organizations who are imminently about to get a treatment approved in the next 6 to 9 months, or maybe not much later than that. We want the meetings to be imminently relevant as you're going in to meet with folks in the state. So looking for patient groups in that, interested in that, and sort of fitting that criteria as well. Finally, maybe I'll say that a lot of our work, this is not work that I do for Haystack Project, but another consultant does for them, but around the comment letters they file with CMS or with RFIs with Congress. We started the year already with a comment letter on the coverage with evidence development criteria. This should be something that all of us should be worried about in the rare disease community. There's a big focus of it on coverage with evidence development policy at CMS was heightened scrutiny around the Alzheimer's drug, which is not rare, of course, but it has led to a setting of precedent that it should be very troubling to the rare community, and Haystack has been working very actively on that. We also did the RFI for dual eligibles for the 6 senators that asked for one, and are currently circulating letters on the essential health benefits and Obamacare plans. And then in the coming weeks, we'll be doing one on Medicare Part C and D, and then on prior authorization. Maybe rather than going through the rest of the slides, I'll just mention that the slides are at our website at haystackproject.org. Thanks, Caitlin. I won't spend any time on them. I don't want to take up more time than I have with the group. So haystackproject.org, at the About Us link, you'll see it says 2022 year in review, and you'll see all of our years in review back a few years are there, so you can see the work we've been doing and can learn more about us. Thanks so much, Caitlin.
Great, thank you so much. We do have a few questions for you here. Someone is asking, how can other rare disease organizations participate in the work that you are doing?
I will put in the chat now that I've stopped speaking. tiara.logan@haystackproject.org is a good place to start. She can help you navigate to whichever part of the projects you heard about today and get you to the right people. This last slide, maybe it's distracting. I'll just mention we also have a speaker series, and any one of our patient groups can recommend. You don't have to know the expert in a particular issue. You can just ask us about a topic, and we will research and invite an expert. So whether you're interested in the speaker series or the comment letters or the work groups or the legislation, just reach out to Tiara and she will connect you into the right places.
Great, and I have one more question for you. Someone is asking, why does HR 6160 not change the burden of proof to the insurer if at least 4 of the criteria are met?
Very good question, actually. So the precedent that we talked about, the legislation is built on, actually did do that. It mandated Medicare pay for a treatment that was off-label so long as it was discussed or laid out in a compendia or 2 peer-reviewed journal articles. Congress today is very different than what Congress was all those years ago when we passed that legislation. And so we did start out with legislation that would do just that. It would be a mandate, meaning you'd have to do it. You would, if it was in compendia or 2 peer-reviewed journals, or in the rare case, since we don't have compendia, it would be in 2 peer-reviewed journal articles or in clinical guidelines. So our hope is to see if we can't start there again in this year's effort to reintroduce the legislation. But we thought it was more important to make some progress, at least have it qualify as being medically necessary, than not be able to move the legislation at all. I've heard from so many patients who say we get denied and we get we get a letter that says this isn't medically necessary. And then on the bottom, it says, feel free to appeal. And it gives you where to go and how to do it and all this, but they don't ever say you're never going to win the appeal because you don't fit the definition. You are not in label or on compendia, nor will you be. And therefore, this appeal route is really frustrating for patients. It gives them hope that doesn't exist. And so our hope is to be able to shift that burden of proof, but we're working and trying to be pragmatic as to what we can achieve with Congress this year. Great question.
Great, thank you so much for answering these questions and for coming to present today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Great. Now, Eric, I am going to turn things over to you. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Eric. He is joining us today from the National Health Council to share their 2023 policy priorities.
Great. Thank you so much, Caitlin, and thank you to RDLA and EveryLife for having me here today. I know I've spoken on these webinars many times in the past, and always enjoy doing this every year where we kind of get to not only for me to be able to speak about some of our priorities, but it's been really great to hear a lot of the priorities of my fellow panelists and really see a lot of overlap and synergy and opportunities to partner together. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to quickly introduce you to who we are at the National Health Council. Next slide, please. So we are a membership organization founded in 1920 as a trade association for patient advocacy organizations. So as you see on the slide here, it includes a number of rare disease organizations and sort of the umbrella rare disease organizations such as NORD and EveryLife. But we also have much larger organizations representing more prevalent chronic diseases and disabilities. So it's kind of the entire gamut to help us meet our mission to provide a united voice for the over 160 million Americans with chronic diseases and disabilities. What makes us a little bit unique is that not only do we have all of these groups in membership, we also have other members of the healthcare stakeholder ecosystem Biopharmaceutical companies, trade associations, insurers, provider organizations, family caregiving organizations, so really the entire spectrum of the healthcare community. But we operate and structure our processes in a way that really ensures that the patient voice is at the center and the loudest voices within the organization. But we do receive that perspective from across all of the various players, so that when we do take positions and take things to the administration or to Capitol Hill, it's been well vetted throughout the community, but ultimately is grounded in that patient voice. So if we go to the next slide, I do want to highlight a couple of resources that we have for you all. One, certainly encourage folks to check out our blog that has periodically posts about all of our policy issues, some of our research, our programmatic opportunities, a little bit about some of our members. We do allow our members to also post guest blogs on topics that are important to them. So it's a really good sort of one-stop shop to see what all is going on within our world. I also do want to flag that we have a whole host of educational resources on our site, things such as training modules, classrooms, webinars, checklists, rubrics, a whole bunch of things on a number of topics. A couple examples, we have our value classroom, which really has a number of resources geared towards groups who may be about to undergo a value assessment. We have a real world evidence classroom and to learn more about how real world evidence is used and can be used in medical product development. We have a series of webinars on patient-focused medical product development, on health literacy. So really, a number of issues that we know are of very big importance to the rare disease community. I also want to highlight one new resource that we've created this year. We have a sort of cheat sheet or checklist for groups that are looking to engage with the new Congress to help you sort of identify who some of the freshman members are that you might want to meet with, and some very easy replicatable steps to really make sure your voice is heard in Congress. I will say this is a free resource for our members, but I know many folks on here are not members. Send me an email, we might be able to work something out, but wanted to highlight that as a new resource that we've created this year. So if we go to the next slide, I do want to echo what Syra mentioned about just hearing how much overlap there is on the group. And so I'm glad I didn't actually kind of put slides together that kind of walk through each of the issues, because I'm going to kind of shift a little bit the ones I want to focus on. I did want to maybe touch on ones that I didn't hear, but unfortunately I did hear all of them. So maybe I'll kind of flag some of the ones I think are kind of immediately here and now, and I think some ones that certainly could use a lot of underscoring. So I want to start just to kind of show you what this document is. It's our kind of matrix that we do to show what are some of the issues that we're putting most of our time and energy on, and then a lot of ones that we kind of keep an eye on, and ones that we are in very active partnership on. So a couple of I do want to flag for folks that I think are really important to highlight and to underscore that we've heard. Certainly as it relates to implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, you see in our sort of lead box there on healthcare costs. A couple of things I want to highlight. One is that we're doing a lot of work really trying to lay the groundwork with CMS as they're rolling out their new responsibilities to negotiate the price of drugs. And one of the things that we really want to ensure is that they are creating those opportunities for patients and patient organizations to really submit data and information to really show what the value of the treatments are that are being negotiated. And we think this is really important as we kind of are setting the groundwork and laying out the first instance of Medicare doing this. Because we really want to ensure that they are valuing treatments that are demonstrating that they meet outcomes that matter to the patients who will take them, that really focus in on that value to the patient, the point that Syra and I believe others made as well. Because we really think that if those products are valued differently, it'll really encourage companies to do a better job of really bringing that patient voice into research and development. So that's one that we've been spending a lot of time and effort and energy really trying to push CMS on. The other I want to highlight is the redesign of the Medicare Part D program to, for the first time, create an out-of-pocket cap, something that many on this call pushed for very hard over the last few Congresses. really pleased to see that go into place. I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of making sure they get that right. Really happy to see that there's a provision in there that will allow beneficiaries to pay that out-of-pocket cap over the course of a calendar year. We think that's really important for people, particularly for those in the Medicare program who are on fixed budgets and really would have a much easier time paying for their care if they can annualize it. But it is the first time that we've really seen that happen. So making sure that that structure in a way that's understandable and usable is going to be really important. Similarly, we also understand that, again, while we're incredibly supportive of the provision that was included, we know that creates a whole lot of new incentives and dynamics in the insurance marketplace. And so really making sure that we're structuring a lot of oversight into what the outcomes of that are in terms of potentially increases in utilization management, what the changes may look like in terms of formulary placement and cost sharing, et cetera. Really want to make sure that we're kind of keeping a close eye on how that goes. So that's another one that I wanted to flag. Sorry. Heard a lot about telehealth. Certainly that's one of, I think, probably the few incredibly bipartisan things that are in front of Congress right now. I think we've seen, I'm very pleased to see Republicans, Democrats, people from rural states, from urban areas really talk about the benefits that we've seen of telehealth over the course of the pandemic and really looking at what the future role is and the permanent role of telehealth in our healthcare system. And so we're pleased to see further extension of the flexibilities that were put in place during the pandemic. I don't think anyone assumes that that's going to be sort of permanently how we structured. I think they'll be looking to kind of make some tweaks and changes into the way that we pay for telehealth and the way that it can be accessed across state lines. And so certainly want to make sure the patient perspective is included. We know there's been a lot of support from the provider community, which is great. But I think we need to make sure we're working hand in hand, patients, providers, payers, everyone, to make sure that we structure the future of telehealth in a way that's going to be most beneficial to patients and most equitable across all populations. And so that's an area that I think we'll see a lot of activity on in the 118th Congress. We heard about passage of the most recent reauthorization of the FDA user fees. Very excited about that. There were a lot of provisions that were included in the PDUFA agreement that we think are going to really move the ball forward as it relates to bringing the patient voice into medical research and development. There will be a number of opportunities for folks to participate in listening sessions and roundtables and summits. There'll be some working groups that are formed. One example there is looking at the use of digital tools in clinical trials. So really reducing the burden of people participating in trials having to go to hopefully fewer site visits, if we can kind of track a lot of the measurables in the home using technology. But it's an emerging science. I think a lot of companies have been doing it sort of as a redundancy to see how that tracks with some of the information they collect at the trial sites. But now if we really want to think about learning from the pandemic when a lot of sites were shut down, to see kind of how companies did in terms of using those tools during the pandemic, I think there's a really good opportunity to rethink how we structure clinical trials, how we can make them less burdensome, how that will impact clinical trial diversity. So I think there's one example of many that were included in the user fee agreement that we'll be working with the FDA as they implement it. Want to sort of flag, I know this was mentioned before, but it cannot be repeated enough, the unwinding of the Medicaid maintenance of effort and people being redetermined. This is going to be an all hands on deck approach between CMS, the state Medicaid programs, patient organizations, providers. I think we're working with CMS, we're working with our members, we're working in other coalitions to make sure that you all will have the tools and resources that you need to make sure you're able to communicate to the people in your networks what they need to be doing now. People need to make sure that they're updating their mailing address, and they have very likely moved within the last few years. And so making sure that information is there and making sure they're looking out for any information that comes to them from their Medicaid program. So, we'll be developing social media toolkits, messaging, information for people who are manning call centers, things like that. Because there are going to be hiccups. We know that's going to happen. Everyone is aware of that. So we really need to make sure that Medicaid programs and CMS are tracking what those implications are, working to address them, and certainly trying to prevent any hiccups to the extent that we can. One other thing I do want to highlight, this is sort of new in how we frame our role here, is looking at mental and behavioral health as well. So we are certainly not going to be the organization when we have groups like Mental Health America, NAMI, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, a number of groups that are very focused on this issue. But I think none of you will be surprised to hear there's been a growing recognition within our membership that chronic disease and mental health conditions are very intricately linked. Sort of arrow of causality goes both ways. People who have severe mental illness often develop other chronic diseases. People with chronic diseases have higher rates of depression and anxiety. So there's that intersectionality there that really need to be making sure that we're focused on as we look at public policy. And again, in addition to telehealth, I think that's one area I think where there's pretty significant bipartisan support for maybe different reasons across the different parties, but we do think that there's an opportunity to really focus in on strengthening our mental health capabilities as it relates to workforce, funding the 988 suicide crisis prevention hotline, looking at mental health parity. So there's a number of things that I would certainly encourage people to be thinking about what your role may be within that, and sort of how mental health may impact your rare disease population, because I think there's a huge overlap and connection. And then last but not least, really enjoyed hearing a lot of the remarks that Jennifer made about really needing to dig in and focus on health equity. That's something that we have been really focused on. We actually are getting ready to announce a new staff person who will be coming in to focus on DEI issues within our organization and health equity policy. So really making sure that that's something that is at the lifeblood of all of the issues that we work on. We're considering what the impacts are on health equity, and certainly working on issues that are specific to health equity as well. So I will stop there. I will also, actually, one thing I wanted to flag too, I saw some talk in the chat and to mention earlier of Congresswoman Matsui. Neither here nor there. I kind of got my start in Washington as an intern in her office, so I was very pleased to see that she has come on as the Rare Disease Caucus chair, and someone who has personal connection to rare disease. As they're very much been focusing on health equity, so I think there's a great opportunity with her in that role. So very excited to see that. So I'll stop there, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, Eric. We do have one quick question for you. Someone is asking if you have a copy of this chart here on your website anywhere, or if there is a way for them to get a copy of it.
It is on our website, and I will post a link to it in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Ellie, I'm going to pass things over to you. Everyone, this is Ellie DeHoney. She's joining us from Research America to share more about their 2023 policy priorities. So Ellie, I'll turn things over to you.
Absolutely. And I will say that I did not prepare slides, which was a strategic mistake, because now I'm looking at myself and I need more blush. But I'm really happy to be here. The first thing I'd like to say is the Every Life Foundation and RDLA I've been around the block a million times. I've been on the Hill for a long time, and they're easily one of the most effective policy and advocacy organizations that I've had the pleasure of working with. And so I really felt it was a privilege to join you all. And this cause is very important to me personally. In my volunteer world, I focus on epidermolysis bullosa and how to increase research funding for that disease. And it goes to something Eric said, and I'll say real quickly, in terms of mental health, I think that a caregiver status should be associated with additional benefits in private and public insurance to sustain emotional and mental health. I myself am not a caregiver. I just have witnessed the heroic acts of caregivers of children and adults with rare diseases and children and adults with Alzheimer's. And so I'll stop there with that. The other thing I wanted to say is, Sarah, the legislation that you have achieved and that you are pushing is so important. So insurance with a too strict medical necessity door to benefits is like not having insurance. And I think the rare disease community knows this better than anyone. So if there's a way that I can be helpful to you, Sarah, I was a legislative director for 11 years and on the Hill for 14. So just let me know if there are ways I can be helpful. So Research America's focus this year, NIH. Medical research funding is at real risk because non-defense discretionary funding is at real risk. So there are just arrows being thrown at this funding right and left. There's an oversight kind of a culture in the House, and NIH has a target on its back. You have the debt ceiling coming up and efforts to reduce federal funding dramatically, particularly for NIH and other non-defense discretionary programs and agencies by a lot, billions. And we can't afford that. It's the hard thing about NIH is often what they do now doesn't come to fruition for 20 years, but it still is the only way to get to fruition on that. Just like if you eliminate the private sector role in R&D, you would eliminate the endpoints. So we'll be working really hard to get at least a $2 billion increase in NIH so we can keep going strong and accelerating medical progress, not just sustaining it. Same with some of our other agencies, FDA funding. If they have less funding, they cut staff, it slows everything down. So we'll be fighting very hard for FDA funding. On the policies front, one area I could really relate to, Jennifer mentioned in the equity space is clinical trials diversity. And to me, clinical trials diversity is inclusive of individuals with rare diseases because the small trial sizes that are an absolute necessity for rare diseases are sometimes dismissed. It's like, it's not a gold standard because it's small instead of it's small because there's no other choice. And so we're working, and FDA has really great leadership. We're working very hard to identify areas where that mindset is affecting thinking on clinical trial design and the ways that clinical trials are viewed in the regulatory process. So that's another area that we're really interested in. On clinical trials diversity itself, we were the biggest gnat in the world with NIH, and we bothered them with a group of advocates to get a clinical trials diversity consensus conference going that brought in patients, that brought in industry, that brought researchers together to say, what does success look like? What does failure look like? How can patients be involved in how hard it can be to get to a trial and what to do about it? All of these things that are actually real world issues. So it's not called the same thing, but we're all invited. There is a scientific workshop that's going to run over 2 days, but it's virtual, so you can pop on and off on March 30th and 31st. At NIH, it's being sponsored by several institutes. If I wasn't technically, just inept, I would put the link in the chat, but what I'll do is I'll share it with my RDLA friends and hopefully they can get it to you. I think it may have been Sarah or another one of the terrific speakers mentioned coverage with evidence development. I do think that it is a very big deal for all patients that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services are now has started the precedent of applying coverage with evidence development to medicines and not just what it has typically been devices, medical devices. So it just amplifies the need just to make sure that those rules are reasonable. For example, if coverage with evidence development, which delays overall access to a product for several years, it can be a decade. requires you to be in a clinical trial if you receive that drug, and your child cannot be in a clinical trial, or you cannot be in a clinical trial because your health doesn't permit it. What does that mean? Is that okay? No, that's not okay. So that's another area that we're looking at. I'll say that gene therapy costs is another area we're really interested in, and any kind of feedback you all have on this. There's a lot of interest in this. And I think that another group we've been working with, who I just think the world of, is the International, did I write it down here in my little cheat sheet? I wish I had, but it doesn't look like I did. You all know about this. It's an international rare disease consortium. This is one of the areas, along with the diagnostic kind of odyssey, that they've been working hard on. And so we're seeing if we can become more engaged in that. But I will say that making sure the funding is there to keep medical progress going and moving faster, and increasing the number of people who benefit from it are major priorities for us. And I'll stop there because you guys have listened for a long time, and you've been very gracious. So let me thank again RDLA, Every Life, and the other incredible panelists that I've had the pleasure of joining today.
Thank you so much, Ellie. We really appreciate it. I'm going to give just a few little updates here, and then we will wrap up. I wanted to give you all a quick reminder about Rare Disease Week on Capitol Hill. We are going to be back in person for the first time in quite some time, so we're really excited for that. Registration is now open for in-person attendees. This registration is only for in-person. We will be opening a registration for live stream options in February, so keep an eye out for that. Also, as a part of Rare Disease Week, we have our training webinars and office hours. We will have 3 training webinars leading up to Rare Disease Week. One is going to be our deep dive policy webinar. This is where we will go over what the different asks are for Rare Disease Week and give you different talking points and information on those pieces of legislation. Next, we will have our team coordinator webinar. This webinar will be only for assigned team coordinators. So we will reach out to you about attending this one if you are needed there. And then lastly, we have the Share Your Story with Policymakers webinar on February 21st. This is a really great webinar to come join and learn how to quickly tell your story and give your rare disease pitch when you're meeting with your policymakers. So I highly recommend attending this one, especially if it's going to be your first time attending Rare Disease Week. And then last but not least, our office hours. You do not have to register to attend these like you do the training webinars. We will send a link to the office hours to everyone who registers for Rare Disease Week. And this is basically just a casual hour. It's just a Zoom meeting where you can come ask the RDLA team any questions that you have about Rare Disease Week. So we have 3 different office hour opportunities on February 17th, February 20th, and February 23rd. So please join us for those if you are attending Rare Disease Week and you do have any questions. Our next RDLA webinar is going to be March 23rd, so please save that date and plan to join us. We hope that you will all be able to come back. And if you would like to speak on any of the upcoming RDLA webinars, or if there's a particular topic you would like for us to cover, please feel free to reach out to me. We would love to hear from you. My email is here on the screen, or you can find it on the Every Life website as well. Also, please follow us on social media, sign up for our newsletter and action alerts. This is how you can stay up to date with what we are doing and what opportunities we have for you to get involved. Of course, if you ever have any questions related to RDLA or getting involved in Every Life's advocacy or policy initiatives, you can reach out to Shannon and I. Our emails are there on the screen for you as well. And last but not least, thank you to our January RDLA webinar sponsors, BioMarin and Pfizer. we are grateful to them, and of course, grateful to all of the speakers who joined us today and everyone who took the time to join us for this webinar. We appreciate all of you so much. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. And we'll hopefully see you all at Rare Disease Week in February. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.